Welcome back to PHIL-1006, The Great Philosophers, here at Fanshawe College, in the summer of 2020. Um, so first things first, I am currently grading your papers. I'm almost done. Those grades should be released hopefully later on today. I'm very impressed so far. So have a look at those comments. I left you some short comments on everybody's paper, but generally speaking, really nice job, everyone. Second thing, though, is that I really want you to complete that midterm. It closes tomorrow. So if you haven't finished that midterm, just please go to FOL. It's online, it's open book, it's open notes, it's open for several days. It closes tomorrow, so please complete that midterm. Just go to FOL, hit, evaluations, quizzes, and you should see online midterm. If you're not sure where to find it, if you're having trouble accessing it, please let me know, and I'll try and fix that for you. So this week we are talking about three different philosophers. In fact, the three different, I would say they're thinkers rather than philosophers, because Adam Smith, of course, is mostly remembered as an economist. Karl Marx is that guy. But Mill is kind of our classic philosopher. We talked about Mill a little bit last week. We talked about utilitarianism last week. So let me just kind of go over it again, because I brought up utilitarianism right at the end of the lecture, a bit as a contrast to Kantian ethics. So Mill, really, what we have is a tradition of moral philosophy here that kind of kicks off with Bentham and then Mill. But let's focus on John Stuart Mill, who kind of gave utilitarianism its classic kind of form, the classic kind of statement of utilitarianism. So J.S. Mill was an English moral philosopher, also someone who was involved in politics, very much a social reformer, and he developed a system of philosophy, a system of ethics that was based on the evaluations on the consequences of your actions. So when you're evaluating whether or not you should act in a certain way, what you're really evaluating is the outcome of your action, right? What happens as a result of what you do. The grounding of morality for Mill is based in psychology, in the sense that there's one kind of universal thing about humans, Mill argues, which is kind of by nature we will seek what we find pleasurable and we will avoid what we find painful. Now, this, of course, can vary somewhat from person to person, but generally speaking, right, if you're seeking out something painful, then it's probably because it brings you utility, brings you some kind of pleasure to it. So pleasure and pain is somewhat subjective, but that doesn't matter because it's still universal. Even animals avoid pain and seek pleasure. And indeed, the utilitarians were amongst the first to campaign for animal rights on the basis that animals also feel pain. And that, ethically speaking, what we ought to do is pursue actions that would give the greatest happiness to the greatest number of people, that would lessen suffering for the most amount of people and increase happiness for the most amount of people. That is what is moral, because we are grounding it in universal facts about human psychology. Everyone feels this. Everyone wants to avoid pain. Everyone seeks things that make them happy. So that's what we should do. The utilitarians kind of conceive themselves as putting ethics on a more scientific basis. They thought happiness could be measured. They thought consequences could be predicted. And ultimately, they thought utility could be calculated. And therefore, especially at the level of public policy, the outcomes of a policy proposal should be evaluated on the basis of its ultimate utility. That is, right, it's the technical term that means kind of usefulness, ultimately on the basis of how much happiness it produces and how much suffering it lessens. Right, so consequentialism is the kind of general term encompassing all views that say that outcomes matter for moral evaluation. Utilitarianism is a type of consequentialism. It says the kinds of outcomes we should pursue are those which maximize utility. Again, utility is a term in the social sciences and economics that kind of measures perceived usefulness. But for Mill, for Bentham, for these utilitarians, utility means more pleasure and less suffering. So ultimately, what we should do is what has the best cost-benefit analysis in the end, in the outcome. Or I think there's a quote here: actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, and wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. By happiness is intended pleasure in the absence of pain. So the reason I kind of have Mill and Kant really one run right after another is because there's definitely a huge difference between the two, and it's a difference that we are still struggling with today in all kinds of policy debates, in ethical debates about duty and the right versus happiness and the good. Because sometimes you pursue duty to the detriment of happiness. Sometimes you do the right even if it's not good. Sometimes you should do what's good even if it's not right in the sense of kind of legally permissible. Right? So Kant says you must do what is right, and what is right is whatever can be properly universalized. That was the whole idea behind the categorical imperative. The categorical imperative says you should act as if the ideas guiding your actions could be universalized without contradiction. So you can't cheat at cards, because if everyone cheated at cards, you're contradicting the idea of playing a game bound by rules. Mill says no, consequences matter. We measure only the outcomes via utility. And we should maximize utility for the maximum amount of people. We should do good, not do what's right. In theory, Mill would say we should cheat at cards if it increased the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Suppose I'm playing cards against Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos and all the billionaires in the world. And if I cheat at cards, I'll win billions of dollars and I'll give that money to charity. A utilitarian might say, yeah, you should cheat at that card game because ultimately you'll reduce more suffering with that money than if you just lost by playing straight. Kant would say you can never cheat. That's never right. So we can see that there's really kind of radically different approaches to ethics here. The utilitarian is quite all right with upsetting the existing social order as long as it increases happiness and decreases suffering. In particular, the utilitarians were very, very clear that everyone has a right to this happiness. Everyone's suffering counts equally. So you can't let people suffer, or you can't deny them happiness on the basis of what people think of as what's right or what their duty is. Right? Your duty to obey, for example. Your duty to, maybe you have to listen to your boss, or to follow the law. Right? If there's an unjust law that decreases happiness and causes pain, then you should campaign against it. You have no duty to the law. You have a duty. What you have to do is evaluate the consequences of actions and policies. So utilitarians, as a result, were actually politically radical. They were as I said, they advocated for animal rights, for the legal equality of women in society. They were against capital punishment. They were for democracy. They argued that the law shouldn't punish for punishment's sake, but the whole idea is that you should deter future crime and reform criminals so that they go on and do good in the world afterwards. So the utilitarians were very much involved in British politics at the time, and they very much wanted to change society for the better, at least according to their views. So this also kind of led naturally to a theory of government. Sometimes, we are tempted to do things that make us happy, that raise our utility, but it might make others suffer. And government exists to make sure interests align, to ensure that we don't act too selfishly and forget that morality is the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Now, this leads to all kinds of nice versions of the theory that I don't really have time to get into, but there's going to be a difference amongst the utilitarians between something called act and rule utilitarianisms. So act utilitarians say something like individual actions should be evaluated in terms of the outcomes they bring. So we're actually evaluating each individual act. Other utilitarians say we should evaluate the outcomes of rules. We should evaluate not actions, but what would happen if a rule was applied systematically. Then we look at the outcome of that, right? So This is kind of an answer to problems like these. Suppose if you execute one innocent person, you could prevent a riot, and that would result in more deaths, right? So you're appeasing like an angry mob. An act utility calculation would suggest maybe that we should execute the innocent person, right? Because that specific action, right, you just kind of weigh it and you're like, well, one person dying versus maybe 10, you know? However, the rule utilitarian would say, what if we evaluated the idea they should always execute innocent people to appease mobs? Would that overall result in more or less utility? In this way, we kind of find a compromise between Kant and the ethics of duty and utilitarianism. So act versus rule utilitarianism is a big distinction amongst proponents of this theory. However, utilitarians basically are against the principle that the ends can't justify the means, right? They do think the ends, in a way, justify the means because the ends are exactly what you're evaluating. I think I've talked about this last module as well, right? So, right, Kant's theory is about universalizable rules. Utilitarianism is about consequences. Um, and often you'll see these public policy debates where people really fundamentally disagree with each other because one person is coming at it from a Kantian angle, the other person is coming at it from a consequentialist utilitarian angle. So you might have read in the news about harm reduction policies, right? So, for example, a harm reduction means, right, you're trying to reduce the harm in the community by whatever means, and that could be, for example, a safe injection site. That means intravenous drug users can get clean needles and medical support, right? So if you're a proponent of this policy, you're kind of a utilitarian because you're saying what we need to do is reduce the social harms of drug use, right? So we reduce pain, right, and we decrease suffering and increase happiness. But some people are opposed to this policy. They say if you facilitate drug use, that kind of contradicts the goal of ending drug use. You shouldn't break the law. And often, right, if you look up editorials for and against harm reduction, again, about safe injection sites, you can kind of like take a step back and see, oh, here's a utilitarian who doesn't understand they're arguing against a Kantian and vice versa. So just to kind of sum up, right, utilitarianism is a consequentialist theory. We're evaluating the outcomes of our actions, and what we are trying to do is, right, maximize happiness and minimize suffering for the greatest amount of people on the basis that this is a psychological universal about human nature. The utilitarians, as a result, were radical social reformers who were pushing for, mass democracy, mass literacy, mass schooling, right, because everyone counts. So let's switch now, and it's not that much of a switch, oddly enough, because once you get into this period of the 19th century, you'll get a lot of social reformers, people who want to put their social theories on a scientific basis and agitate for a different kind of world. Um, so I very often talk about Karl Marx in my philosophy classes. Um, the reason I do so is not because I'm necessarily a fan of his thought. I'm actually not. But because, like it or not, he is a thinker of historical significance that has influenced the events of the last few hundred years. And whether we are critics of Marx or admirers of Marx, it is really imperative we understand what he was saying, either to give better arguments against him or to separate out what went wrong from maybe any insights that might have been actually present, right? So again, teaching and understanding a thinker we disagree with is not implicit endorsement. We're just trying to understand the history of ideas and how the world has changed as a result. I have quite a few slides on Marx. I actually grabbed it from another class where we spend a little bit more time on communism versus capitalism, socialism, all these other issues, but I'm not going to do the whole thing. I'm just going to kind of give you an overview. So let me just actually start by talking a little bit about Hegel. Now, Hegel is not a guy who's very well known outside philosophy. Some people who know a little bit about Marx know that Hegel was a very major influence on Marx. Hegel is kind of a German philosopher, an idealist, that is someone who believes that What we have knowledge of fundamentally are our ideas of things and not reality itself, right? Kant was an idealist as well. We don't have access to the world as it is, mind independently. We only have access to our ideas of reality. Um, so what Hegel argued for was a kind of a idealism, that is, we only understand our own ideas of the world, right? We can only access the world through our perception, and then how our perceptions combine to create concepts. So you kind of see why some empiricists became idealists, because we only have access to our sense perception and the mental combinations of sense perceptions that create concepts and theories. Um, so what Hegel's going to say is knowledge is always human knowledge, and it's always going to be relative to a historical context. There's only one real truth you should be thinking about, which is that all truth is going to be historical. It's going to be true relative to the development of ideas in a socio-historical context. Right? As he said, philosophy is always its own time, comprehended in thoughts. Right? Um, and subjective idealism, these evolving ideas within a context, are going to be more real than material reality, but they're dynamic and evolving. So you take Plato and then you add a little bit of Heraclitus, right? And then you get this kind of like ideas that are dynamic and evolving with human existence over time. So what Hegel's going to say, and this is where you're going to start getting some Marx, right? This is where you can see Marx getting his ideas. He's going to say the evolution of history is the evolution of human ideas, right? Of humans understanding themselves and their place in the world. And this will progress in predictable stages. Of somebody makes a thesis, there's a view of the world. However, this thesis invites an antithesis, its opposite, because there's contradictions in the thesis. It can't quite hold together. There are things it can't explain. So the natural move you're going to see when you have an idea is the negation of the idea. Not a whole new idea, right? It's easier to say not this, right? So you have an idea and the negation of that idea. Eventually, people try to create a new idea on the basis of reconciling the thesis and the antithesis, right? As the negation itself becomes a worldview, it clashes with the old worldview to create a new one, the synthesis. And the cycle begins again with the synthesis forming the new thesis, right? So you have a concept which is challenged and destabilized, and the contradiction is resolved in a new idea, a new worldview, and then it starts over again. And if you understand history, Hegel says, you have to understand the process by which our ideas of reality are created, challenged, and recreated. The direction of evolution for Hegel is increasing self-consciousness, but I'm not going to get too deeply into that part of Hegel. The idea here is that you have what he calls a dialectic, which is stages, right, occurring in kind of a series of arguments. So this is what Marx takes up. Marx will take up the thesis that history proceeds by a series of dialectical movements, where instead of a worldview being challenged, we have a form of economy being challenged, resulting in a new form. And this cycle continues. And so Marx has a theory of history, like Hegel has a theory of history. This was a very Enlightenment idea. It's a very modern idea, right? That history is a scientific enterprise in such that it could be predicted once you understand it, and will result in a direction that can be seen. So history is not chaos. History is not just Game of Thrones where things happen. History occurs in predictable stages where progress is inevitable. And of course, 300 years from now, we'll be living in a shiny Star Trek future because history has a direction to it. A lot of if you want to understand modernism versus what people call postmodernism, postmodernism, one of its really key critical concepts is that you cannot have a theory of history. History is chaos. There's no progress that is necessary outside of what we try and do. There's nothing inevitable about historical change. And as a result, you can't have a theory of history that unifies all of humanity under one narrative thread where things just kind of play out like as if it was a story where you know the ending in advance. Right, so postmodernism rejects Hegel, rejects modernity's view that progress is inevitable, and rejects a key claim of Marx, which is that there's a dialectic to history. It's a materialistic dialectic, unlike Hegel's dialectic. So when you hear people talk about things like a postmodern neo-Marxist, that doesn't make a lot of sense to my ears because really, if you strip the dialectic out of Marxism, you're not left with a lot. You're left with some stuff, but really not as much as you think. Um, so Marx takes Hegel, right? Reads it, thinks you're right. History does progress through stages, but what drives history are not ideas. What drives history are the material conditions. We need to think about how we produce, how we consume, what we manufacture, how growth occurs, what trade is, and so on. And if you analyze the material conditions of a society, you'll understand it properly. So Hegel kind of gets it backwards. Ideas are the driver of history. The economy drives the ideas. So the economy and the material conditions are the drivers of history. However, it works more or less the same way. So Marx is going to say, right, we have right different systems, there's a revolution, and then we have a new system. Right? Stages of history where we have is a thesis, an antithesis, eventually that leads to a revolution, and the revolution creates a new synthesis, which in itself starts up the whole ball again. Right? Um, So obviously, from the perspective of 2020, this seems to me a really wrong idea, almost a quaint idea, right? That history progresses in these kind of neat stages with clear distinctions. There's a revolution, and I can look back and apply this map to all of human history. I don't really believe that this can work at all. Um, there is an insight here that obviously we should have pay close attention to the material conditions of a society in order to understand it. But from this study, that you can start predicting history. I don't think you can predict history. If there's right nobody, if you could predict the future, if you could predict the future, you couldn't predict the future because you'd have to take into account the fact that your predictions about the future will modify the future. Think about it. If you could predict the future, you couldn't because the predictions would modify the future of which you're making a prediction of. Anyway, this doesn't work. I don't like it. Um, anyway, what Marx says is that the capitalist system has contradictions to it. The contradictions will result in revolution, which will lead us to first socialism and then eventually communism, which is the last stage of history, where because the things that lead to revolution, the conflicts inherent to every system, are going to be gone. Um, so what are the conflicts that create thesis-antithesis relations for Marx? Class conflict. The fact that you'll have people who own things and the people who don't own things, and the owners get to tell the non-owners what to do. This creates conflict. Um, let me just skip a few slides here. Um, Again, let me separate out the idea of history having a materialistic dialectic that is predictable from the idea that there's a relation between material conditions and social structures. So there probably is. I mean, just think about how file sharing really upended some aspects of the economy, right? I was a teenager. I was like 18 or so when like Napster and these like file sharing services came online, and you could just download music from the internet. Before, I had to go to a CD store and, plunk down $20, $25 on a Nine Inch Nails CD and kind of just hope it was good. And then Napster comes along, and all of a sudden, I have 100 albums on my hard drive for nothing. And it completely changed the economics, right, of the music industry. For better or worse. I'm not going to give you a moral account of what happened. I'm just telling you I was there in 1998 or whatever when Napster came out, and right, because the underlying material conditions changed, right, we had to have a new culture of music, right, because scarcity plummeted, right? I can get any amount of albums very quickly and basically completely free for the cost of an internet connection and a couple hard drives, right? So for a lot of musicians now, right, they make their money off touring and merchandise, right? And the music itself is kind of a loss leader. Right? You might sell some vinyl records that you sign or something like that. Right? So Marx had this one insight, which has something to it, which is that fundamental economic relations will modify social relations. right? So there's what he calls the base superstructure distinction, right? Marx views the base of a society as its economic relations, as its material conditions. And as these material conditions change, it'll trickle upwards and make new social relations. This is actually really, I think it's a pretty important insight. And we can separate out Marx's historical prescription that capitalism will be replaced by communism, etc., with his insight as a sociologist and economist that started spelling out why, right, the economy and our social worlds were so interlinked, especially before, because you get theories like Hegel's, right? It's very kind of artsy and abstract and like, oh, it's our ideas of reality that shape reality, and Marx is going to say no, it's where we get our bread. Um, So, here's a great quote here. To Hegel, the real world is only the external phenomenal form of the idea. Right? So ideas are first, and then the real world matches our ideas of it. And Marx will say, no, that's crazy. Right? The ideal is nothing more than the material world reflected by the human mind. Right? Um, so again, why we talk about Marx still in the 20th century, the 21st century, right, is that despite some very bad theories, right, he did take sociology, economics, other disciplines away from the idealism, which was very prominent in the 19th century, and back on the path towards actually being a measurable, quantifiable empirical science. And that was pretty important, right? For example, about the labor theory of value, right? So he asserts that economic value is equivalent to the labor used to create the commodity. So the value of my phone, right? So how do you make money off a phone? Well, the value of the phone is labor plus materials, right? So the labor transforms the materials into an object that has value. And then the capitalist takes it and sells it as a markup. And he's just pocketing the difference. So why have a capitalist? Right? Probably Marx's labor theory of value is in self a response to Adam Smith. And Marx had a critique of Smith, which was actually really important in the history of economics. And responses to Marx eventually led to the contemporary theory of what we call marginal utility. So this is just part of economic history, right? Marx's own theoretical ideas about capitalist economics are really part of the historical dialogue on the topic of neoclassical economics. You just can't get around his importance here. Um, That being said, we really need to separate it out from his argument that capitalism, though dynamic, is unstable, that will be marked by increasing class division, by increasing concentration of wealth, by financial crises, by conflict between workers, right, and the bourgeoisie or the owners. Um, and that this instability is going to result in eventual collapse and the rise of the classless system, communism. Right? That's the part where, right? So Marx's prediction, obviously, I'm just going to look at my chat box here. All right, nobody's typing away. So Marx said, look, capitalism is unstable, and the country with the most advanced capitalist economy will be the first to crash, right? Because all the contradictions will be so sharp there, because capitalism will have reached its highest degree of development, and thus its highest amount of contradiction. But capitalist economies kept developing and didn't turn to communism. Instead, what happened in 1917 is this feudal country, Russia, this agrarian, underdeveloped, non-industrial economy underwent a revolution in 1917, led by a vanguard party under the leadership of Lenin. And Leninism and Stalinism had to kind of fill in the blanks and explain why they were becoming communist in the complete absence of a collapsed capitalist economy. Um, and it was a disaster, obviously. It was a disaster because Marx's ideas about communism, first of all, are bad because they're rooted in a view that history necessarily progresses through revolution. That's a bad idea. And it was also bad because these people, Lenin and Stalin, right, exiled, murdered opposition, had planned famines, and were just basically horrible dictators. So when we think of Leninism, Stalinism, Maoism, these are ideological variants of Marxism that try to account for the fact that revolutions occurred in largely agrarian societies instead of advanced capitalist economies that recovered from their crises. Um, in fact, it's kind of interesting because while Marx theorized that communism was inevitable, he refused to really give any details about how it would be arranged. He said it would arise through the historical process. It was not the realization of a predetermined moral ideal. Probably what Marx thought is that eventually we'd get to the point where, we're at this kind of Star Trek level technology. We have replicators or whatever, and as a result, there's so little scarcity that capitalism makes no sense anymore. I mean, maybe, maybe not. Is this inevitable? No. Um, but again, there's that one little grain of truth, which is that, I don't know if you guys watch Star Trek, but if you watch Star Trek, there's something called a replicator, and you just walk up to it and you say like, tea, Earl Grey, hot. And then it just gives you a cup of tea. And you don't pay for the cup of tea because the replicator just created it out of nothing. It doesn't cost anything to make. Because you could just magically create it. And there'd be something kind of weird about having to pay money for something that came out of a replicator. Right? Am I supposed to pay money to who programmed it? To who owns the idea, the copyright of tea? That doesn't make a lot of sense anymore when you drop scarcity to that point. So whatever truth there is that there's a relationship between the economy of a society and its social relations and the way it's arranged is completely a separate point from Marx's view that history will unfold in a series of predetermined stages culminating in a perfect communist society. And as a result, right, we kind of tend to focus on the revolutionary ideas, and fairly so, because wherever you try to force this revolution, you get really awful bloodshed. And I think this is a big failure. I'm skipping over some slides here. You can look at them, right? So if we're going to talk about the failure of Karl Marx, I'm not going to talk about Marxism as an idea. I'm just going to talk about Karl Marx himself. There is a theoretical failure here because he focuses on revolution as the necessary transition in his dialectic. But violent revolutions destabilize societies. They lead to the breakdown of systems that keep people fed, housed, right? The successful violent revolutions, you can count them on one hand, right? So yeah, is extermination, repression, mass terror, plant famine, can you find these anywhere in Das Kapital? No, you can't. But you can find them pretty much anywhere there's revolutionary politics. And the age of revolution, 1775, 1850, as many historians have called it, right, it accompanied these things. And the idea of revolutionary politics being necessary for change in the direction of progress is a huge impediment, right? Generally speaking, peaceful progress is what works. Once you get a sufficient amount of the population on your side, progress is almost inevitable. And everywhere where human beings are doing well, and you can just look this up on Wikipedia, what are the best countries to live in? We see countries where you have social movements that agitate for change, but not violent revolution. How am I doing for time here? I feel like I've been ranting for half an hour. I'm just ranting for half an hour. Right? And as we discuss this, it's important to kind of distinguish communism, which is Marx's view of the final stage of history brought to you by the collapse of capitalism and a violent revolution. And this is distinct from the idea of socialism, where communism came after. It's just kind of a radical variant of socialist ideas, which had been around for a long time. So the idea of socialism, democratic socialism, dates back to the French Revolution, right? What a socialist argues for is that there should be public ownership of some sectors of the economy, maybe all of the sectors, but at least some. And there's a diversity of views how this should be accomplished. But it's important to remember that public means public. It's not government control, because a government doesn't necessarily mean it's public. It doesn't mean it's democratic, right? A government could control the economy, but it could be an authoritarian government, could be a dictatorship, right? For the socialist, if you go back to these writings in way back, in the 1780s, 1790s, early 1800s, right? You'll see that it's really about public ownership and a really meaningful form of participation by the mass public in the economy, right? A lot of socialists believe you should actually keep markets. You should keep monetary prices, right? Some people talk about central planning. Um, but the basic idea I'm trying to push for is that um, communism, as a Marxist ideology, is inextricably linked to the idea of a material dialectic, which I think is a stupid idea, if I can editorialize a little bit, and should not be understood as the same thing as socialism. Right? There's lots of economies, modern economies today, which are kind of just hybridizations of a market economy and a socialist economy. Right? If you look at Denmark, about half of the economy, half of the GDP is government spending, and it's pretty good place to live. Um, the reason the Nordic model, right? Okay, Marx. There's so much Marx here because I had this is all taken from another class where I kind of did a really deep dive here. But I'm going on to 40 minutes here, so you can look at these slides. There's some other interesting aspects of Marx, um, but let me just skip over, since I was talking about socialism anyway, to theories of capitalism. Um, so the socialist, unlike the communist, argues that some of the elements of the economy should be under public, not private ownership, um, which is distinct from capitalism, which is characterized by private ownership of trade, private ownership of finance, of industry, um, fully market-based resource allocation, right? This includes labor, really sophisticated pricing and investment mechanisms. And the kind of key classical theorists of capitalism here are going to be Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and yes, John Stuart Mill, who we talked about at the top of the lecture. One of the classic early texts of capitalism is The Wealth of Nations. Smith argues that wealth is created by open trade, where people pursue their relative advantage in producing goods, and you shouldn't be hoarding gold, you shouldn't be plundering other people, right? This kind of old mercantilist feudal system is not actually going to create more wealth for everyone. Right? So you need to, right? You need to actually have open trade and production in a market-based system. And I got a funny slide here. So maybe the most significant idea of Adam Smith that I want to talk about here is the idea that individuals pursuing their own rational self-interest can actually lead to an efficient outcome without the need of kind of a lot of central planning or interference. Smith wrote, right, look, it's not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. Right? The basic idea is actually fairly simple. Right? If everybody's just in open competition in the marketplace, everyone wants to maximize their self-interest, right? But what goes for the seller goes for the buyer as well, right? So if I want to buy some bread, my self-interest is buying the most bread at the cheapest price. The baker's self-interest is selling, right, the most bread at the highest markup, right? But because we have these competing interests, unlike what Marx says, aren't going to cause tension, they're going to cause the solution. Because if there's 10 bakers, their interest is selling as many as possible at the highest price. My interest is buying what I want at the lowest price. So they're all going to compete amongst each other because I'm doing the purchasing. So all the bakers are going to, how do you keep your margins up while selling a lot? Well, this will promote efficiency and innovation. The baker who's capable of producing more bread at a lower cost is going to sell more bread. And as a result, the next baker is going to go, oh my gosh, I'm going to go out of business if I don't compete, so I better innovate. And as a result, everyone's rational self-interest to compete in the marketplace creates a nice equilibrium here between supply, demand, price, and quantity, right? Here, the theory says, right? Because if a product could be manufactured more efficiently, right, it is the interest of the capitalist to do so, because they'll have more people purchasing it. So the free market can promote innovation, can promote efficiency, can promote access to goods. And the conflict between classes is actually resolved in the supply-demand curve. Right? And this is kind of the fundamental insight of Adam Smith, right? That you don't need a lot of government interference. You just need to let the market do its magic. At least that's the way a lot of modern rereadings of Adam Smith goes. Um, and I say most modern rereadings because a lot of people that point to Adam Smith as one of the most important theorists of the free market forget that he also, if you read The Wealth of Nations, he also says, you know, everybody pursuing their self-interest in the marketplace only works under the condition that the marketplace is the best place to make money, right? If you could be corrupt, if you could form a cartel, if you could buy off politicians, all these are easier ways to make money than competing. And competing is hard. Innovation is hard. Surely, if I could just like ask for a monopoly from the government, surely if I could just lie, cheat, and steal, if I could just put a little bit of wood chips in my bread recipe and no one's the wiser, if I only poison 5% of my clientele, that's the way to make money. So you have to Adam Smith is very, very clear. Government has a role in making sure that everybody follows the rules of the marketplace. But if they do, right, if they do follow the rules and you are competing in a free marketplace where lots of different companies can provide a product, right, and nobody's cheating, you get this beautiful thing, right? You'll see spontaneous coordinated action occur as if it was planned. And in fact, it'll be better than if it was planned. Right? Rational actors maximizing their utility in an open economy will create spontaneous orders as if it had been all planned in advance. And that's amazing. You could prove it mathematically. But the conditions are onerous, right? It doesn't just happen, right? You have to have rule of law. You have to have people have to follow contracts. You have to have a lot of consumers must have access to information to make good decisions. They can't be systematically deceived. Actors have to actually be rational. And if these conditions aren't met, the market won't function, right? So this is Joseph Stiglitz, Nobel Prize-winning economist. He says, look, behind the free market ideology, there's a model which argues that market forces drive the economy to efficient outcomes, right? And this is true. There is a model, and you can mathematically prove it. He says, one of the great achievements of modern economics is to show the sense in which, right, the conditions under which Smith is correct. But these conditions are restrictive. Whenever information is imperfect and markets incomplete, the invisible hand works imperfectly, and many of the key activities of government can be understood as responses to the resulting market failures. And so there's conditions under which the market can kind of be magical. And when these conditions fail to hold, that's when intervention becomes necessary. And that is kind of the whole capitalist versus socialist debate, right? Like, what is the extent of market failure? What is the proper response? And how much of the economy should we be regulating, and how much should we just be kind of like, do your thing? Again, Smith says the same stuff. Like 300 years ago, Smith knew this, right? Whenever the legislature attempts to regulate the differences between masters and workmen, its counselors are always the masters. When the regulation is in favor of the workmen, it is always just and equitable, but it is sometimes otherwise when in favor of the masters. The government of an exclusive company of merchants is perhaps the worst of all governments for any country whatever. The profit of those merchants would be almost equally exorbitant and oppressive. Right. So Smith, preeminent theorist of classical capitalism, warns us. Right. Our merchants frequently complain of the high wages of British labor as the cause of their manufacturers being undersold, but they are silent about the high profits of stock. Right? The high profits of British stock may contribute towards raising the price of British manufacturers as much, perhaps more than the high wages of British labor. So like, it's 1790, and he's saying, yeah, stock buybacks and inflated prices are really what's causing problems for your company, not minimum wage. And this is Adam Smith in 1790. So, right, Smith is very much aware of the limitations of markets, right? And so are a lot of countries, right? So one nice example, I think, of a place where markets are not able to do their magic is, for example, healthcare. So there are conditions under which markets operate well. One of the conditions under which they do not operate well might be healthcare. Markets do really well when you have a good that you could buy or not buy, so it's not essential. When goods are fungible, which means that you can trade the good easily for cash. When you can easily compare many different versions of the good of the thing you want to buy to kind of rationally decide which one is the one you need. Now, healthcare basically does none of these things, right? If you're having a heart attack, the good is essential. You can't just say, well, I'm going to wait till prices go down to take care of my heart attack. You need it now. Um, the good is not tradable. It's not fungible. It can't be stored, right? I can't trade my cardiac surgery for a car. It just, right, the way I could if I had a commodity, right? It's healthcare is not very useful to think of in terms of a commodity, right? So the healthcare, the goods of healthcare aren't easily turned into a marketable commodity. People have tried through like complicated insurance schemes, right? So the good you trade is your insurance coverage instead. Um, but the countries that have done this typically have worse outcomes than countries that spend less money as a percentage of GDP, right? So maybe in this case, because healthcare is not the right kind of good, capitalism really actually results in an inefficient allocation. On the other hand, let's think about market success, right? Like, I mean, I love my phone here because I have like terabytes of storage on the thing, right? I have the entire Lord of the Rings extended edition on this phone. So if I'm ever bored, I'll just start watching like Lord of the Rings. The idea that I could have a 10-hour movie series on my phone blows my mind. But phones are a perfect example of a commodity which the market can handle well, right? Instances of the good are equivalent, they're tradable in cash, they're liquidable, right? There's a lot of information available to the consumer. I can look at, if I'm looking at storage, I can compare prices, reliability, storage amount, speed, and I don't need to buy it. I'm not going to die if I don't have a hard drive. I can wait until prices drop. I can wait until other consumers adopt it and see how they do so I have more information. All right, so the when it comes to like computers and information technology, markets are again basically magic, right? Storage cost per terabyte, right? Look at these exponential growth curves, right? Network capacity, right? Dollar per gigaflop, dollar per megabytes per second, right? Beautiful exponential curves of increasing efficiency. Why? IT, about as good a marketable commodity as you can imagine. So capitalism works really well here. In healthcare, capitalism performs really poorly. But again, there's a lot of asterisks on this, of course, right? So um, I'm just saying we shouldn't be too ideological about our views of socialism versus capitalism, right? It's ideological to believe that because there are conditions under which markets are efficient, then they're a universal solution that can't possibly go wrong. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. Likewise, yes, markets are sometimes dysfunctional. That doesn't mean they should never be used. Right? What we have is a complex, interdependent relationship between government and markets, between regulation, enforcement, contracts, the law, the environment, right? And there's going to be no one ideology that tells you what to do in every single economic case. So, revolution, and yeah, I have some slides here, but I'm already going on like how many minutes am I on here? 53 minutes. So I'm gonna wrap things up, right? So I have my last slide here, talk about challenges to capitalism. So one of the challenges to capitalism that we might talk about um, has to do with environmental impacts, what we call externalities. Uh, an externality is the economic name for when the full cost of making a good isn't accounted into its price. For example, I could be manufacturing my magical hard drives, but then I'm dumping all my pollution into a river. Somebody else is going to have to deal with the cost of a polluted river, right? Maybe the runoff in the river harms agriculture, and as a result, they have to absorb eventually, right, $1 billion loss. That $1 billion cost isn't factored into the price of the hard drive. Right? That's why I'm able to have a cheap hard drive, because the pollution is an externality. Worse still, what if this externality, this cost, this real cost, is not passed on immediately but to future generations? So that people living 100 years from now have to deal with the fact that our highly efficient mode of production, in fact, wasn't efficient at all. What it merely did was obscure the costs, the true costs of products, as a tax on the future. In this case, what we have is a market performing extremely inefficiently. Of course, what's the alternative? If you look at countries where you had a communist regime, you had also tremendous levels of ecological damage. So, is there a solution here? I think we're going to require entirely new ideas to deal with these challenges, to deal with pollution, global warming, and not sure if anyone has them. All right, on that downer note, I'm going to sign off. Hope you enjoyed this lecture and complete that midterm. Thanks.